Thanks for tuning into this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. In the early 13th century, the Catholic Church stood at the height of its power. It had survived centuries of war, internal schism, and the political maneuvering of kings and emperors. But in the lands of southern France, an enemy emerged that it could not tolerate. This wasn't a rival kingdom or an invading army. Instead, it was an idea, a faith that rejected the authority of Rome, a movement that undermined the Church's claim to be the sole path to salvation. It was not the first heresy the Church had faced, but it was the first to gain widespread support among both the peasantry and the nobility. And it was the first that would be met not with debate or excommunication, but with annihilation. For the first time in history, the Pope called for a crusade not against infidels in the Holy Land, but against fellow Christians. The armies that marched south were not driven by faith alone, but by the promise of land, wealth, and absolution from all past sins. What followed was not simply a war, but it was a campaign of extermination. Entire cities were put to the sword. Those who resisted were burned alive. Those who submitted were forced to kneel before inquisitors who demanded their confessions or their blood, and often both. The nobility of the region, once powerful in their own right, were stripped of their lands, their influence shattered. What had once been a culture distinct from the rest of France was brought to heel under the rule of the French crown, and its independence erased. But the impact of this war did not end in the ashes of the battlefield. The methods used to crush this movement would lay the foundation for centuries of persecution, control, and religious violence. The Inquisition, created in the aftermath, would spread across Europe, wielding fear as a weapon more powerful than any army. The concept of total war, of annihilating not just an enemy's forces, but their culture, their beliefs, their very existence, would reemerge time and again, from the religious wars of the Reformation to the ideological conflicts of the modern era. This was a war that was never meant to be remembered. Let's now experience the Siege of Montségur.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 14, The Siege of Montségur, from November of 1243 to March of 1244. Inquisition forces, as many as 10,000 soldiers at its height. Cathar forces, 11 knights and 150 soldiers. The fall of Montségur was both the end of a siege and the total annihilation of a religious faith. The last sanctuary of the Cathars, deemed heretics by the Catholic Church, was reduced to silence in fire and blood. Their doctrine did not fade by choice, nor by debate, but by the merciless hand of steel and flame, leaving only echoes of their defiance in the ashes.
Martin Luther is often credited with igniting the Reformation, but long before his defiance shook Christendom, others had risen to challenge the Catholic Church. From the moment Constantine made Christianity the official faith of the Roman Empire, dissenting voices emerged. Sects that questioned doctrine, condemned corruption, and rejected the growing entanglement of the Church with earthly power. Rome saw these challenges not as theological debates, but as existential threats. To question the Church was to defy God himself. Such defiance could not be tolerated. Heresy had to be crushed. In France, one of the greatest challenges to Rome's authority came from the Cathars. They were a sect that had taken root in the south, particularly in and around the town of Albi, hence why they were also called Albigensians. By the 10th century, their teachings spread like wildfire, drawing strength from a belief system that mirrored the dualistic faith of ancient Persia's Manichaeism. To them, the world was locked in an eternal war between good and evil. The devil ruled the material world, and since the Old Testament God had created this world, he was responsible for its corruption. Salvation lay not in sacraments or papal decrees, but in rejecting the flesh, living a life of purity and seeking escape from a world drowning in sin. The movement's leaders, the Perfecti, were held up as living examples of righteousness, men and women who had renounced all earthly pleasures to walk in the path of true holiness. The very name Cathar likely came from the Greek katharos, or purity. They lived simply, helped the poor, and preached with a zeal that put Rome's clergy to shame. While Catholic bishops draped themselves in finery and extorted tithes, the Cathars moved among the people, tending to the sick and speaking against the church's excesses. Their message resonated. Commoners turned to them for spiritual guidance. Nobles such as Count Raymond VI of Toulouse saw them as allies in resisting the ever-tightening grip of the Catholic Church. The south of France had long been wary of northern influence, and the Cathar movement was as much a political defiance as a spiritual one. Rome took notice. In 1165, an ecclesiastical council condemned the Cathars as heretics. For a time, this was little more than a declaration on paper. But when Innocent III ascended to the papacy, he had no interest in empty proclamations. He sought action. At first, he tried persuasion, sending envoys to turn the Cathars back to the church. The Cathars ignored them. Then one of the Pope's representatives was murdered, and that was all the excuse Rome needed. In January of 1208, a crusade was declared. What followed was not medieval warfare. It was wholesale slaughter. French troops under Simon de Montfort descended up the south with a fury that sent entire cities up in flames. When the forces of Christ reached Béziers on July 22, 1209, they demanded the townspeople surrender the Cathars within. The city refused. The subsequent attack was swift. The defenses crumbled, and then came the massacre. Every living soul was put to the sword, men, women, and children. Somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 people were slaughtered, though only a few hundred had been actual Cathars. When asked how to distinguish heretic from faithful, the papal representative supposedly answered with chilling indifference, quote, "Kill them all. God will know his own," end quote. Word spread. Some cities surrendered without a fight. Others resisted and met the same fate as Béziers. The city of Toulouse fell, and Count Raymond VI was driven into exile. By the 1230s, the Crusade had largely broken the Cathars' power, but Rome was not satisfied with mere battlefield victory. This war was ideological, and any lingering embers of heresy had to be stamped out. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX unleashed the Inquisition. Priests turned interrogators scoured the land, hunting for heretics. Those who were captured faced a brutal choice: renounce their faith or die in agony. Some repented, others resisted, and a few, defiant to the last, chose the flames. One final stronghold remained: Montségur. Montségur Castle rose from the land like a stone sentinel, perched atop a towering, near-impregnable hill 400 feet above the wooded plains below. To the faithful, it was a sanctuary. To the church, it was an open defiance that could not stand. The fortress was held by Raymond de Perret, a Cathar sympathizer who had long sheltered the sect's most devoted members. The Cathars used the site as a place of worship, where the sacred consolamentum ritual was performed, the final rite that marked the transition to the rank of perfectus. But Montségur was not merely a temple, it was a fortress. And when the French army marched on it in May of 1243, it became the last battlefield of the Cathar Crusade. Inside the walls, roughly 500 defenders, 11 knights, 150 soldiers, their families, and the Cathars themselves, prepared to withstand the siege. Leading them in battle was Pierre Roger de Mirepoix, a warrior hardened by years of conflict. Opposing them was Hugh d'Arcy, commanding 1,500 men, though his numbers would soon swell to nearly 10,000. The French planned to starve them out, but Montségur was no ordinary fortress. The terrain made a complete blockade impossible. supplies slipped through the lines at night. The sheer height of the castle rendered catapults useless. Months passed. The French received reinforcements, but the siege dragged on. Then, in November, the tide turned. RC managed to position troops on a narrow plateau near the summit. It took weeks of grueling effort, but the French slowly dragged siege equipment up the mountainside. By December, their catapults were operational, pounding the outer defenses. The Cathars, though, fought back. An engineer smuggled into the fortress built a counter-catapult, hurling stones down onto the besiegers. The French suffered, both from the enemy's fire and the brutal winter that gnawed at them as they huddled in the cold. After Christmas, they made their move. A group of French troops, possibly aided by a traitor, scaled an unguarded path, slipping through the darkness until they reached the base of the outer fortifications. With a sudden charge, they seized the Barbican, the outermost defense. They were now within striking distance of the main castle. Inside, the defenders saw the end approaching. On the night of March 15th, the Cathars held their final service for all who wished to receive the consolamentum. Not a single one renounced their faith. The next morning, on March 16th, the French marched the Cathars down the slope and into the valley. They were given a last chance to recant. None did. A pyre had already been built. Wood was stacked high. The Cathars were not tied to stakes. Instead, they walked willingly into the fire. 225 men, women, and children embracing the flames. Those too old or weak to move were thrown into the inferno. And it was over. A few scattered Cathars survived in hiding, but Montségur marked the end of their rebellion. The Inquisition carried on for centuries, and Languedoc, once defiant, fell under the rule of the French crown. Yet the region's spirit of independence was never truly crushed. When Protestant Huguenots rose centuries later, it was here, in the land of the Cathars, that they found their strongest foothold. The church had won. Its enemies were ash, its authority unchallenged. But the flames that devoured the Cathars did not merely consume flesh. They seared the conscience of Christendom itself. The Inquisition, born from this war, would spread its grip across Europe, a weapon of faith wielded with steel and fire. Centuries later, the embers of Montségur still smolder in the memory of mankind. Was this victory, or was it the moment the church, in its hunger for dominion, sacrificed its very soul? One of the most legendary figures associated with the Cathars, Esclarmonde de Foix, was a noblewoman and a Cathar perfecta who became one of the sect's most defiant leaders. Though she was not at Montségur during the fall, she spent her life spreading the faith and resisting Catholic persecution. Some legends claim she never died, but transformed into a dove and vanished into the heavens, a Cathar symbol of their enduring spirit. While no exact words of Esclarmonde de Foix have survived, historical accounts suggest she was a fierce defender of the Cathar faith, engaging in theological disputes and standing firm against the Catholic Church. At the Council of Pamir in 1207, she reportedly argued against Catholic doctrine and refused to submit to papal authority. Her reputation as an unshakable believer, combined with the Cathar tradition of defiance in the face of persecution, allows for a historically grounded reconstruction of what she might have said in the face of the Inquisition. You come with swords and fire, believing you can unmake truth by slaughtering those who speak it. But truth is not bound to flesh, nor is faith undone by the fear of death. You wield power over the body, but not over the soul. We do not kneel before corruption, nor do we forsake what is righteous to save our own lives. You may burn every last one of us, but you cannot set fire to the light within us. And long after these flames have turned to ash, others will rise, who will see you not as saviors, but as tyrants, who waged war against righteousness itself.